In this session, we're going to look at implementing UML selection statements in PowerShell. So I'm going to start with the example I had from the last session where we were creating an array and generating Fibonacci numbers. Let me zoom in here a little bit to that loop that we have here. And what I've inserted into the loop is after I generate a Fibonacci number, I'm creating a variable that I'm assigning to false. And if that Fibonacci number is indeed odd, I will change it to true. Okay? So I have what we call a single selection if statement here, a single selection statement, where only if it's true do I do something. And if it's not true, I don't do anything, I skip over it essentially. So I'm assuming that the Fibonacci number is going to be true. So I'm setting odd to false. I could change my logic and assume that it's true that it's odd, or that it's true that it's even, or false that it's even. It's just a matter of what I change here along with my condition. Okay, and so my condition is, I'm saying if that Fibonacci number that I just generated, mod 2, is equivalent to 1, then I know it must be an odd number. Now, you have to understand that the mod operation is essentially a remainder operation. So it's divide by something and give me the remainder. So I'm dividing that Fibonacci number that I just generated by 2 and saying, what is the remainder? If the remainder is 1, then it must have been an odd number. The only other option is that the remainder was 0 and it was an even number. You can think about that some. But for our purposes here of implementing the logic, I'll assume that we understand that logic and say that, okay, if the remainder is 1, it must be an odd number, and so I'll set odd to true. And therefore, if it turned out the Fibonacci number generated was an even number, the remainder would be 0, not 1, and it would essentially do nothing, leaving odd at the value of false. Okay, there's the logic. Now, as far as translating it, let's take a look at the PowerShell code. I think I'll zoom in here a little bit more so we can see this. So we can see here that, where to go? Here's where, after I've generated the Fibonacci number, I am setting this variable odd to false, assuming that it's not odd. And then I'm saying if, so if is a keyword in most languages, followed by a set of parentheses with a condition in them. So it's very similar to the loop that we did in the last session where we had the keyword of when and a condition. Except this time we're saying if this condition is true, then we are going to do something. And the default is that if it's not true, we don't do anything. So all I have is a single set of curly braces to say, okay, if this condition is true, do what's in the curly braces. And if the condition is not true, skip right over it and go on to the next statement. So if fib element index, that we just generated again, mod 2 divided by 2 in the remainder, if that remainder is 1, then I am going to set odd equal to true. I'm going to assign odd the value of true. And then I'll continue doing that through each series of loops. I think what I'll do is, before I implement that, let's compare and contrast that with an if-else statement or a double selection or alternate selection if statement. So here, same thing except for instead of initializing a variable outside of my selection, I go immediately to my selection and I say, okay, if the remainder is 1, meaning that it was odd, I'll set odd to true. Otherwise, or else, if it's false, I'll set odd to false. And so now every time I come through here, I'm doing one or the other. Okay, and so in my code then, what I see is that here is my if statement with my condition, same condition as before. I'm checking to see if the remainder after dividing by 2 is 1 or 0. And if this is true and the remainder is 1, I know it must have been an odd number, so I'm doing this block of statements that says odd is assigned true. Then I have a keyword else. And so if this condition is not true, then I'll jump to my else clause where I will say, okay, assign odd false. Okay, let's see it in action. So I'm going to come back here to my single selection if statement and say, grab this, copy that, and paste it into my editor over here. Control S, I'll save it, bring up my CLI, and say, hey, PowerShell, take a look at this program. And I get an error. And I'm like, oh, this is great. And so what I see here is the error message is at this file on this line number, this character position, if, so it's my if statement that's the problem, and $fib element $index mod 2 is what's underlined here, and it says the assignment expression is not valid. The input to an assignment operator must be an object that is able to accept assignments. And like, okay, yeah, well, that makes sense. Except that why is it complaining about an assignment operator? In fact, why does it even think it's doing an assignment here? And notice what's underlined is the first part of this. And so what it is, I'm used to other languages, in PowerShell, our comparison operators are a hyphen followed by a couple of letters. A lot of other languages, C-based languages, will use the double equal sign as equivalents. So I'm going to change this to -EQ and save that and try this again. And now it works. So great. But did it work? I don't know. So let's do this. So after I do this selection statement, I'm going to say, hey, write to the host the value of, let's see, $fib element index, so that value we generated, and additionally, after that, write out the value of odd. Okay, so I'll save that, I'll run this, and get an error message. And that is because, let's see, let's read it. Actually, it doesn't tell us until afterwards. It says, array index expression is missing or not valid. So that index was missing. Oh, yes, that's because PowerShell expects a $sign in front of variables, like some languages, but not all. And again, C-based languages don't, so I've got to get my head in the right game here. Okay, so I save that, and then I run this, and sure enough, I see there's the 37 Fibonacci numbers. 1 is true that it's odd, 2 is not odd, 3 is, 5 is, 8 is not, 13 is odd, 21 is odd, 34 is not odd, and so on. And I'll leave it to you to see the pattern here and figure out why does that pattern work. But we've accomplished what we set out to do. I guess what we should do before we leave this session is to say, okay, what about, that was a single selection if statement. What about our double selection or alternate selection? So here's our if else. So I will copy this and come over to my editor. And I'm going to Control A, select all, Control V, paste, and paste this new version in here where we can see that we have the if else. And I know that I'm going to have to fix something like, that it should be a equivalence operator in PowerShell of a -EQ. So if I save that and then go to my CLI and say, let's run this version, it runs. If I were to put the same write statement in after my condition and say, write host $fib element $index brackets and then $odd, save that, rerun it, we see we should get the same exact output. 1 is true that it's odd, 2 is not, 3 is, 5 is odd, 8 is not, and so on. Okay, I think we did it.